Well, welcome to HopeCast, a ministry of Hope Church here in Richmond, Virginia. My name is J.G. Carter, and I'm happy to get a chance to talk with our senior pastor, David Dwight, today. We are coming to the end of a sermon series we've been journeying through about the concept and the idea of new. And so we thought it would be an opportunity for us to kind of reflect on what's come up during all of this. David, I'm sure you've gotten feedback along the way as you've preached several sermons in the series.
Yeah.
And we just want to kind of delve into some of the ideas that are kind of entangled in this idea of new. So happy to get a chance to visit with you.
Yeah. Look forward to it.
I think it'd be helpful maybe, and this is maybe beyond the series itself, just as you're developing sermon series, and I know you guys maintain a calendar for a good bit out, you're planning a series that will be in months from now. Is it usually a germ of an idea? And in particular with new, I'm curious kind of a little bit of the spark that got you thinking about what would a sermon series on new, which at the surface is unclear to the untrained or unheard ear.
Well, I'm sort of smiling because I'm like, wait a minute, you're asking the chef for his recipe. This series or other series, I basically have a couple of places where I keep ideas. They're just running ideas. It's like a list of a log of ideas, and I keep that list going. I add to it. I come back to it, and some of those ideas grow. Like, that idea I jotted down, that's grown. I have more interest in it. I feel like I've got more passion for it, and so I'll pursue that more. Other times, an idea is like, why did I write that down? Like it's gone. I try to pray about those ideas and those lists. And then twice a year, I spend a week away, and all I'm doing is spending the whole week framing up sermon series that are coming in the future. Now, there have been other conversations with other people on our staff to communicate and to share ideas. I will share with a select group of people on our staff. Here's some ideas. Like I'll say, I've got a study leave week coming up. That's this week when I'm going to just go plunge into sermon series. And I'll say, here are a handful of ideas that I'm pursuing. Can you all share any that maybe stand out to you significantly? Like you'd be like, yeah, definitely do that, or don't do that. And do you have any other ideas that you'd like to be considered?
Right.
So I'm probably the primary holder of the ideas, but I'm also trying to collaborate with others on our staff, others who will be preaching in the series, different series. So that's kind of how they get formed up. Then I go out of town. I'm usually in a place where I'm like a monk for a week. I'm making a lot of coffee, and I'm in a pretty quiet place. I'm trying to be uninterruptible. I'm trying to really make the time set apart to pray and ask God to develop and lead this. Often in my mind, JG, I am praying, saying, God, you know what you want people to hear. Will you shape this week the decisions that are made? You know who's going to be there on any given week. You know what's happening in their life. I don't know all that. And so can we just do this in a partnership where I'm just the pen, but you're the hand that's making it right? That's kind of my perspective on it a lot. And then I start going for it, and I start framing up ideas and shaping out the weeks of it, pursuing scripture and that kind of thing. So that's the general behind the scenes way it happens.
I suspect there's a file that's ones you haven't given up on, but you could never get them to take the shape you want it yet.
Yeah.
In process.
Those are they sort of stay on the list. They haven't been eliminated, but they also haven't become a sermon series yet.
Right.
A lot of this comes out of reading.
Yeah.
I read a lot, mostly because I love to. It was very interesting to me the other day, and I don't want to make this good or bad or better or worse, but somebody said to me that they're starting a new discipline, and the discipline includes reading 20 minutes a day. And that was interesting to me. Now, there's other stuff that I should be doing that I don't do, but I probably read 3 hours a day just 'cause I just 'cause.
Right.
Just 'cause.
Right.
I love it, um, and everything that happens with it, and that reading is just the way with prayer that I am constantly trying. I think of sermon generation as a well, and it's got water in it. And so when you give a sermon series, a bunch of the water got removed from the well. So you got it, that well has to keep getting more water put into it so the well doesn't run dry. And one of the ways that the water keeps running into it is just reading.
Right.
So
There's a sermon series embedded in that idea that there's how do you replenish your well. Talk a little
Right.
bit about this series that we're heading to the finish line on,
Yeah.
called New. Just how that process you just described, make it specific to New, like what ideas kind of got you there, maybe what reading you can remember triggering this idea.
Some of these ideas sit in the hopper for years.
Yeah.
And I would say this one had been in the hopper for years. And maybe this is part of the praying that goes on behind it. Like, why does it come out now? Okay, so the first verse of this series was the first week of the new year, 2025. And this verse comes out of Isaiah chapter 43.
Right.
I think I heard this verse. I mean, I've been a Christian for 42 years now. I bet I heard this verse in earnest, like it got my attention 35 years ago.
Mm.
And this is Isaiah speaking God's word. And he says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing, and it springs up before you. Do you not perceive it?" Right? I could give the sermon again because I find so much of that so engaging. Behold, I am doing a new thing. The word behold in its own right says stop and try to take it in. It doesn't just mean look, it's deeper than that. So God's saying stop and try to take it in. Take what in? I am doing a new thing. Okay, but he doesn't tell us exactly what it is, right? This is part of the faith element of it. So we'd be like, well, what new thing? Where's the new thing? How are you doing the new thing? What does it look like? What am I supposed to do about it? I think all of that comes in our desire and our efforts to deeply know God. Okay, so the more closely we walk with him, the more we will be attuned, this is my way of saying it, to the frequencies of understanding what he's communicating with us. So I'm doing a new thing. But then the question, it springs up before you, which kind of makes me think in my mind, like, where?
Yeah.
It springs up before you. You're like, look to the left, look to the right. Where is it? Do you not perceive it? He asks, which is such a beckoning question. He wouldn't ask the question if we did perceive it.
Right.
So that verse has so much rich calorie content in it.
Yeah.
And I remember having these thoughts about it early on when I heard it, but then over time I'd hear it again. So I threw it into my sermon series idea list. And then I was thinking about, it was probably most of our sermon series are planned 6-ish months out.
Mm-hmm.
I know people that do it much longer than that, but for us, we do it about 6. And then I started thinking, well, it's the new year. As I was planning out, what's a sermon series to start the new year? And so the symmetry of that worked pretty nicely. We're sort of wired for new at the new year.
Right.
New steps, new resolve, new things we'd like to pursue, new fresh versions of ourselves, all that kind of stuff. New steps, new progress, all that. So then I decided to put it there. But over time, what had grown is the word new in this kind of way appears in the Bible a lot. And it's God who's doing the new making. God's the agent who's doing the new. Well, then once you sit back and start thinking about that, like,
Even the expression, it sprung up. In other words, you didn't go pursue the new. We don't go pursue the new. It springs up in front of us.
and then the question, do you perceive it?
Right.
So our part of it is perceiving it. Once we perceive it, then we begin to sort of walk along with it. But like, to go back to the sermon series thing, like on these study leave weeks when I'm working on it, I might work on this for 2 hours in the morning with fresh coffee. And then this thought hits me: God is the one who does the new. And then I'm like, you know what? I'm putting my pen down. I'm going out for a long walk.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to roll that thought around in my mind, pray about it, think about it, walk with it for 2 hours. And then I'm going to come back and, that's kind of the way the rhythms of those sermon preparation weeks go. But if we step back for a minute and say, God is making things new, then you're like, well, what is he making new? Then, of course, I've got tools that everybody's got, which is like, you can do a little word search, you can do some concordance searching, look up verses that render that God is doing new things. And you start seeing verses that resonate. There are others that maybe don't get my attention as much. People could hear a series and say, well, why didn't you choose to speak about these verses or those verses? And for me, it's the ones that garner my attention and interest.
Well, and the thing that's been interesting going through this whole idea of he is creating new things, it gets beyond just what, because I think, at first blush, you ask that question, well, what's new? What is new? But it gets beyond that. It is in his character. And I think I can't remember if it was the first or the third week, I remember you trying to get at this idea that this is who he is in the world. And I think we can kind of keep him in a box that's comfortable for us. And in reality, he's broader than broad. And he is by definition new, even though we have a hard time understanding that newness because we're trapped in our sense of old and new. It's very different than his.
Right.
By definition.
Right.
And I think you said at one point, we're just discovering something new to us about him.
Yes.
And I wonder, I'm sure that's come up in feedback you've gotten, and as you've preached the sermons, we're really talking about the character of God, the source of new, not something new.
I think of other verses that add what I would call just like supporting thoughts to this. So a verse that many people know and love is Lamentations 3. His mercies are new every morning. I mean, tons of people hold on to that verse with a lot of hope for what it gives and what it means. But his mercies are new every morning.
Right.
I don't think we would latch onto that verse if it said his mercies are here every morning in the same way.
Yes.
Or if his mercies are the same every morning. Now, there are things about God that we do want to be the same, right? Because we want to know that he is an enduring foundation. But there are also things that we want to know are new. His mercies are new. I think about that. Maybe to say every morning's a stretch, but many, many mornings I think about that.
Well, and maybe you thread the needle in that he is constantly new.
Yes.
So in some ways, he's absolutely consistent.
Yes.
Because he is constantly new.
Yes. And when I think about like his mercies being new every morning, I'm thinking, today is a new day that God has given us. The freshness of the gospel is new to us today. The freshness of God's love is new to us today. It's fresh. It's not been there, done that. It's not going to get worn out and tired. And this becomes, I think, a really, really important idea, particularly when we think about eternity, right? Because I feel confident that part of the experience of heaven is that it is ever new and fresh forever, eternally. That our experience in heaven has woven into it newness and freshness for all of eternity. If it didn't have that, we would get to some point where we'd be like, we're bored with it. I often use kind of the example of, pick some game. Like I think when your kids and my kids were younger, if you think of video games, they weren't as sophisticated as they are now. But like my son would buy a new game. Like let's use one like Madden football. And again, back then it wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. He would play it furiously until he got tired of it.
Yeah.
Why? Because he more or less had figured out what happens here. He more or less had exhausted the options of what you can do with your players and the plays that you can create. Now, a good game means he played it for months and played it a lot with his buddies. Took a while to run the course, but it finally did. And what happens then? That game never gets played anymore.
Right.
Heaven cannot be like that. So, and when I say that, I mean, I'm certain that it's not. It must have eternal freshness with it. And I am certain that this is connected to our intimacy with God in heaven. And we will never get to a place in heaven where we have this been there, done that kind of feeling. Like, I'm bored. What do we do next?
Right.
It can't be.
Somewhere early in the series, I wrote down when I was listening to you talk, the two words that I wrote down were yield and receive. That in order to receive something new, you first have to come to terms with what's in front of you, the old that's in front of you. And there is a yielding to it that maybe that was a personal reaction, but it seemed to me to be running through all the way up to when we enter heaven. Can we yield completely? The hope is that, yes, you're fully yielded and then able to receive because you're beyond yourself when you've been fully healed.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was an interesting, I kept listening then through the subsequent sermons about this idea of what is our orientation? How do we react to the new? Because all of us, out of insecurity, out of past hurts, you talked in one of the sermons about people who had experienced deep grief and deep trauma, that there was this sense of turning a corner and being able to simply yield and receive something. It sprung up. I didn't do anything to create it. It's just I'm interacting with the character of the God who created me. I don't know if any of that rings a bell for you or.
Well, it promotes a lot of thoughts. So a little bit of what the word yield does for me is be open to it. One of the things that I think is really important in our life with God, if we want a rich, intimate relationship with God, is we have to be open to Him. Now, I use that word and people could say, you could use it flippantly. Well, you got to be open to God. No, I mean it in a rather deep way. We have to be open to Him. Well, what does it take to be open to Him? I think it takes a lot. And we don't learn this overnight. One, I have to be humble, meaning I have to embrace myself as the smaller and God as the bigger. I think a lot of us could say, "Oh, I do that." Okay, but wait a minute. One of the reasons I think it's possible that we do not perceive the new is because we have decided what this life with God is supposed to look like. We have created the path, the plan, and the picture, and we have sort of told God, now, God, do your thing to make my path, plan, and picture come into being. And a person could say, I'm humble, I'm trying. And I don't mean this in a value judging way, but if I'm the one creating the path, the plan, and the picture, and God has to fit into it, I am the bigger and He's the smaller. And then he has to perform for me. And when he doesn't, when it doesn't roll out that way, we can be disillusioned, unhappy. We can say, God, you're not living up to your end of the bargain. And we can come to a crisis. And sometimes that crisis will make a person chuck the faith that they had. Other times it comes to a crisis, which is almost God saying, you realize that this whole thing you've been doing with me for all these years is you told me what my little seat in your life is going to be. So you're not open. And because we created the plan, we set our vision on a certain compass heading. And one way we may miss the new thing God is doing is, let's say it's a degrees, 360 degrees on a compass heading, and we're traveling at 300 degrees because we have absolutely set our vision of our life with us in the driver's seat at 300 degrees. And God's like, I'm doing something new, but guess what? It's at 90 degrees. Well, we didn't even see it. We didn't even know about it. We weren't even paying attention because the only place I was looking was the way I had decided my life is supposed to look. And so God's like, I'm doing a new thing. It's over at 90 degrees. And we don't look at 90 degrees. We only look at 300 degrees. These are just little examples of it.
It makes me think of, I think this is a connection, in John 9, when Jesus heals the blind man.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read that story, the folks who are supposed to know what's going on have the most questions, and the guy who knows the least in that story has all the answers. And at one point he said, no one has ever done this before.
Mm-hmm.
And they're stressing because he did it on the Sabbath.
Right.
And they couldn't explain it. It didn't fit the paradigm, and they wanted answers about what was going on. And the answers came from the one in the story with the least credentials for answering the question, except he'd encountered a living God. He said, no one's ever done this before. I can't tell you how he did it. All I know is I see.
Right.
He was yielded.
Right.
And he received.
I think that one of the things that is very, very, very prevalent in many expressions of Christian life, whether people know it or not, is they're operating on an expectation of a bargained arrangement with God. God, if I live my life this way, doing these things, then I expect that you will provide this. That's not a biblical idea, but it is in the air in a lot of Christian subcultures. It will almost always lead to a great disillusionment at some point in time, because underneath of that is, God, here's what I'm doing, and here's what you ought to be doing. When some big, painful, hard life quake comes along and God doesn't, quote, do what we thought he's supposed to do, we hit a crisis of realignment. And the crisis of realignment is either going to be, I'm chucking my faith and reestablishing my own position as the driver of my life, or I am realizing now, maybe for the first time seeing, that I told God all along to sit in the back seat and do what I tell him to do. And I'm now seeing it doesn't work that way. He is God. And when I say jump, he does not say how high, because he's God. And the realignment then can put us into proper alignment, which is he is God and I'm not. He's the bigger, I'm the smaller. He's Lord, I'm the servant. And when we begin to enter that alignment, I think we begin to become humble. And when we begin to become humble, we begin to become open. And when we begin to become open, we begin to experience a relationship with God that probably passes anything we've ever known.
All these ideas in my mind float around this word yield.
Mm-hmm.
It is an acknowledgement that I can't control all these circumstances. My common sense choices don't always work out. And you just simply have to yield to the fact that there's more going on than I can see, but I trust him.
Yeah.
In the midst of those sometimes awful things.
Yeah.
It's a huge chin up for someone to kind of yield in that way and then receive.
Yeah.
I just think it's Oswald Chambers, this devotional writer, has got this famous line that our path to intimacy with Christ's concerns in the world tread along the frontier of our own need. Meaning you have to be willing to enter into your need and kind of admit it and release. Now, the irony is when you stop gripping it, some freedom comes to you.
Right.
Because your bearings have gotten aligned, to use your analogy.
Right.
So anyway, it's interesting to me that what's going on inside the person prior to and after a new thing happening has a lot to do with recognizing it, much less being able to receive it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sometimes, I think we love the idea of new meaning a happy new thing. Sometimes new comes through hard. Oftentimes, our attention is gotten more when we experience something really hard than when we experience something really happy. Sometimes the door to new will come through a deep hardship or a deep grief or a deep loss. And on the one hand, that can sound very ominous. Like listeners might be thinking, whoa, I don't think I want to go down that road. And I can fully appreciate that. But if we really have a God-sized view of life and eternal life, it's not as ominous as it may feel or sound. But said another way, often we are made new when the old is stripped from us. And usually the old doesn't get stripped from us except through something really hard.
Right. Or the old fails us and we realize I'm not using the tools I need to navigate all of this.
Right.
My mom used to tell us all the time, hard's always hard. Hard's not always bad.
Right.
And that sounds a little simplistic, but at the core of it, it's true. And we sometimes do get pushed to yield through these hard things because we feel helpless. The frontier of our own need, as Oswald put it.
And if the yielding is the door to a real experience with God and all his newness, then sometimes that painful thing that brings us to that door is an immense gift.
Yes.
I remember years ago beginning to play around with a question, and occasionally I would ask it in some kind of a teaching venue. I'd say, would you rather have an easier, worse life or a harder, better life? And first of all, people are like, wait, I don't think I understood what you just said. Say that again.
Yeah.
Would you rather have an easier, worse life?
Everybody's reaction to that is, that's a trick question. Wait a minute.
Right. Or it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Because it is so counter to the cultural ways that we see life. Whether we know it or not, almost all of us deeply believe that an easy life is a better life. So what if actually a hard life is a better life? So this idea that the hard actually can make us a kind of person of openness, love, compassion, freedom that we never could have become aside from the hard. So then the hard becomes an incredible gift. And you start using these words that sound like oxymorons. You hear, I've said occasionally, something like, it's one of the hardest, best gifts I've ever received.
Mhm.
And then once again, we're like, wait, what did you say? One of the hardest, best gifts I've ever received. How could a great gift be a hard thing?
Right.
Because of the benefits that come with it.
And that's counterintuitive in your head. It's a reshaping of your heart that allows you to enter into that possibility that something hard could be the best.
Yes. Yes.
But it's your heart that's got to yield and receive something new to be able to get there. Because in your head, this is just hard. We all have disappointments in life. Things don't turn out like we always want them to.
Yeah.
And if you stay up top in your head, you aren't using the tools you need to receive what's new in the midst of those hard things. I mean, that's been my experience out of my own failure in that. I've lived a lot of my life in my head and missed some things springing up in front of me as a result.
Right. I'm thinking of a dear friend of mine, and we were friends in college, and he and his wife had a 27-year-old son who died. They have another son who has special needs that are particularly challenging. And I know we could say, special needs are challenging in their own right. That's true, but these are particularly so. And just through a host of stuff, a few years ago, I was in a conversation with him, and he was speaking about a conversation that he and his wife had had. And he said to me, and he has a deep, deep faith. He said to me, we've concluded that God has called us to a hard life, and we're good with that.
Mm.
Just think about that for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
We've concluded that God has called us to a hard life. Now, a lot of people would be like, whoa, I have so many questions about that statement and God's goodness, his sovereignty, his love, etc. You know that I know him well enough to know that in that statement, he is in no way reducing the depth of God's love for them, the power of God's call in their life. The other thing is, he has done some things professionally that are very substantial and quite unique. And I don't think he could have or would have done them if it hadn't been for some of these hard things in his life. Mm-hmm. Right? So all of this goes back to, can I yield and be open to God? And there's a lot of the gospel woven into this. But sometimes an American version of Christian life is that if it's Christian, it's easy and pleasant. Mm. Much of what's in the Gospels, particularly the last week of Christ's life, is not easy and pleasant. And yet, this is where so much of the fullness of what the gospel is all about comes to light.
Well, and I think you quoted the scripture in one of the sermons. I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me. That by definition tells you there's hard things ahead as we navigate all this. Let me get us to pivot maybe off of this or bounce off this idea. In the fourth sermon in the series, you challenged the audience. Do you have I think your word was bigger picture for your life, mm-hmm. a bigger vision for your life? Mm-hmm. It came to mind because I'm thinking about you have to have a larger vision to say what he said, to say that my life with God and in Christ includes sometimes very hard things. You've got to have a bigger. I'm curious just how you connected those dots and just reflect for a minute on that challenge you laid out about trying to encourage people to kind of lift their eyes up and say, there's maybe more at stake than you realize in this idea.
Mm-hmm. That was a sermon, the New Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And the idea there was that he's making a new place for us. And that this rendering of the New Jerusalem is a place of utter fulfillment, joy. There is no sin, there is no darkness. And this place is coming. and it's real. And if we don't have a big vision to know that there is a large, large scale hope coming, at some point you're just going to kind of end up sort of giving up. We're going to say, what's the point? What am I doing? Why am I just grinding through this? And if we do have that understanding, we have a sense of all of this stuff about life and the big questions. We do have a sense of where it's headed. We do have a sense of how the story winds up.
Yeah.
Um, if you're living and you don't have any sense of any of that, and life is just really hard, repeated over time without a hopeful vision is going to turn to despair.
Yeah.
And I think I said in that sermon, with this vision, hard is still hard, but it's experienced completely differently because we have this big vision that tells us how all of this ends in God reconciling things, healing things. Jesus saying, behold, I'm making everything new. And if we can carry that kind of vision, and I did make a little distinction when I said, do you have a big enough vision for your life? And I said, in this case, I don't mean things you're hoping for. Like, you know, any number of people might be saying, I'm hoping to get a new job, or I'm hoping for a new romantic relationship, or I'm hoping to make more money. Those are hopes and they have value, but I'm talking about something bigger than that, something that transcends circumstances.
Yeah, there you go.
Something that is bigger than what my life is happening to look like at the moment. If we don't have that kind of a vision, then it becomes really a grind.
And I remember you encouraged people to consider the implications of that big vision in their day-to-day life.
Right.
You made a joke about getting through TSA security or in the checkout line at the grocery store, going about the day-to-day normal circumstances of our lives, but can it be infused with this idea of that bigger vision of what God's up to in the world as he lives in us?
Yeah.
And it changes navigating, I think, a lot, both the hard and the easy things of life, the fun and the not so fun things of life, if that larger vision can come and then influence what feels like very mundane, practical things that you meant. You had several
Right.
reeled off.
Yeah. At one point I was even trying to think of the examples of the most mundane things. You know, you're folding your laundry. There's a new Jerusalem coming. And I think of a lot of C.S. Lewis's writings that have this backdrop behind them. Lewis refers to life this side of heaven or before all things are made new as the Shadowlands.
Right.
Another way he conveys this is the idea that our existence is lived in the winter, but the spring and the thaw and all of the newness is coming. Now, we would say, I don't get that because we have seasons and we see flowers and all that kind of stuff. He's speaking more of it from the character of our existence is lived in a winter. And there's a day coming when the winter will thaw and things will be made new. If we know that, we live with that, incredible. You have recently been through some hard deaths of people close to you. Your sister, a very close friend. Am still in the midst of helping a family with a funeral from one of my oldest friends,
Right.
who just died. Having this kind of understanding that everything will be new one day, when you put it against the backdrop of death or funerals, it makes all the difference.
Yes.
The entire framework of our perspective of it all is completely different.
Yeah, I think we talked a good bit, and you were good to stay in touch during my sister's passing. I think I told you on one of our calls, I was grateful to kind of sense, maybe is the right word, this kind of undertow of hope running through the middle of some very difficult circumstance, both for her and her kids. And I think she knew that hope. And in some ways, she was experiencing her own decline differently than those around her,
Mm-hmm.
because she understood that hope.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a rock solid thought for her. She did
Mm-hmm.
have a bigger vision.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of, that the tailwinds of her hope in that regard, I could just feel it as we moved through those days. Even though there were some really tough days, and she declined, and I could just feel there was a tide carrying all of these circumstances somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very reassuring to me in a strange way. I was sad as could be, and I was empathetic and sad for her kids as they watched the process and when she ultimately passed. But it was remarkable to sense that little, I don't know the right word, undertow or tide, kind of just continuing to lift the ship a little bit. The analogy's breaking down, but I appreciate it so much, and all of that, feeling that and sensing that, and kind of being sustained by it.
Your use of the word tide or undertow, something about that is very meaningful. And I'm trying. I think we both know we're trying to patch together pieces of things that we partially understand,
Yeah.
believe are true. So there's a gap between partially understand and believe are true.
Well, and an undertow or a tide can't be literally seen. It can be
Right.
sensed, and you can see
Right.
the impact of it,
Right.
but you don't see undertow.
Right. Yeah. And so in the backdrop of the process of dying, there's this tide that is beckoning home in a Christ-centered hope. And that just makes all the difference. And so everything that we're seeing in the hope of the resurrection, I also emphasized the resurrection is the biggest of all miracles, and any other miracle is just a small little subpart of that. The resurrection is that assurance that God is making things new. And Jesus is the creator of the universe. The Bible is very clear about that. So when the creator of the universe is raised from death, we can have good assurance that the universe will be raised from death.
Mm.
And he is making everything new.
All things new.
Yeah.
Let me, as we close, just give you an opportunity, or if I pressed you to say, if somebody who hears all 5 of these sermons when the series is complete, are there 2 or 3 kind of key things you'd like them to walk away with, an impression or a thought that might be new or fresh? It may be too much there to actually distill it down to a couple, but I'm wondering if you can kind of preview that for the folks listening.
I think part of it would be what we talked about, which is don't let go of, or how can we say it another way? Always keep active in your understanding this big vision. Always. If we had a little gear wheel in our brain that always had that, everything's going to be made new, there's a new Jerusalem coming, I think the degree to which it would change and impact our day-to-day living would be quite dramatic.
Yeah.
You're talking to the person who's scanning your groceries at the grocery store, and you got this little gear wheel. There's a day coming when everything's going to be made new. How does that impact how I talk with the person who's scanning my groceries and just that? So if we hold that vision and it's part of our everyday living, I think that's beautiful and important. And I think the Bible wants us to do that, right? Like the book of Revelation, for people that know the Bible pretty well, The book of Revelation has a lot of stuff in it that's hard to understand. But the book of Revelation is a book of vision, and it's the last book of all 66 of the Bible. I just kind of am not a person who believes that it's all coincidental.
Right.
So when the last book that God has given us to hold on to in the scriptures is a book of eternal heavenly vision, that makes a pretty strong point to me.
Yeah. Really good stuff. David, thank you so much.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Hopecast. We're glad you've been with us. If you've enjoyed it, share it with some folks you know. If you're interested in knowing more about Hope Church in Richmond, Virginia, you can check us out at hopechurchrva.com. And you can join us on Sundays, where services are live streamed and they are also available on YouTube.